Most welcome to 750 of the H series. And I'm recording by myself. It's going to be a couple of days here before we get back to the library once more, at latest by the 28th. But I will do one lecture a day, I'll try. And I'm going to put some extra effort into these lectures. And today I walked outside to prove a point, and that is that Wittgenstein had a point. There is a reality somewhere lurking about, and it couldn't be more obvious than today. It's about 10 minus here. It feels a lot colder because of dampness. It's a beautiful day though. Sunshine is the bonus of having really cold weather, and that is something we have seen very little during December. I'd say November, half of October. And I think we human beings need the sun. I think there's even somebody saying that vitamin D that comes through the skin, well, we don't get enough of it. But I don't know about that. I try to eat my liver as frequently as I can, and I do drink my cod liver oil, although it's rather vile in taste. Let's see here. Well, I will start with an easy way of going into Wittgenstein, and I have to add that Wittgenstein himself said that philosophy, at least how he perceived philosophy to be, it's a life chore. It doesn't stop anywhere. It is constantly going on, and it's developing and getting more and more interesting. And that is the case with Wittgenstein, more than any other philosophers, I would say. I would take up a problem that was mentioned by one of the adherents of Wittgenstein, and that was Paul Feyerabend. And this is rather a easier way to get into Wittgenstein, because if you're going to try Wittgenstein head on, you are bound to get hurt. It doesn't lend itself for onwards attacks. It's a bit like a fortress. Think about these medieval fortresses that the Germans built in southern Bavaria, situated on a cliff with excruciating high walls and a big moat around them filled with some nasty animals. That's attacking Wittgenstein head on, because it needs to come in small portions. If it's a life chore, you don't open philosophical investigations. You read it through a summer and then you put it in the bookshelf. No, not at all. And although the Swedish publishing company Bonniers had published several times philosophical investigations, like pockets for a cheap 59, 69 crowns, in the idea to people bring it with them on vacation, or the afternoon read while at work taking a break. It's just doesn't work that way. It's not with Wittgenstein. It won't happen. And if you only have philosophical investigation, it's going to make it even harder. No, you need a lot of background material, and it would be helped to have read Tractatus as well. And good luck with that book. Let's see here. No, a better way is use the other ones who got inspired by Wittgenstein. A good example is Mark Forsby. His exposure of Wittgenstein is quite eloquent. It's very good. Henrik von Wright, maybe the only great Swedish-speaking philosopher in modern time, is another one. But you can also see the influence in Quine and similar. And another more far-fetched idea is to study pragmatism. Pragmatism does actually, I'd say, share the same intellectual level. That intellectual level is lacking in analytical philosophy. It's sometimes just a play on words. There are some stronger analytical philosophers, but the mainstream is rather, how can one say, it's rudimentary thinking. Well, let's get to the chase. Paul Feyerabend, in his book The Conquest of Abundance, mentioned in one of the first chapters that most people don't understand or realize that even within classical physics there are great contradictions. There is a tendency for people to perceiving science to be a big coherent lump, and that it would be quite easy to, of this lump, make a picture of the world somehow, understand the world. Nothing could be farther from the case. Nothing. And Feyerabend mentions two examples of things within classical physics developed from the onset of early 19th century until modern days. And those two things are thermodynamics and hydrodynamics. They are not coherent. It's impossible to borrow the whole project of thermodynamics and put it in hydrodynamics, or vice versa. Neither can you put the both of them in some sort of bigger scheme. So why is this? Well, here it could be good to remember a slogan that is not absolutely correct, but use it in the beginning, and then it will be a support that you don't need anymore. You can lay it on the side. But language is use. I think that's a good starter. Language is also bigger than ourselves. It must be that. Language never stops either. It's infinite. So what are these thermodynamics and hydrodynamics? You don't need to know any details, but I already mentioned for you they started in the 19th century. Well, that means from a Wittgensteinian viewpoint that they have different histories. And as you remember, Wittgenstein is very much into history. It's not something to be fondled with. And if two practices have different histories, they cannot be coherent. It doesn't matter how close the cooperation is, there's going to be differences. You can think these differences almost like languages from a regular basis, as we usually perceive languages to be a means of communication, which is something only an analytical philosopher would say. It's a very crude simplification and it's not very accurate as such, but it goes for the example. We know that spoken Jewish language, Ivrit, is not much older than almost at the start of the State of Israel, 1948, something like that. Already today, only 70 years later, there have developed two dialects. So in that short time span, and without doing much practice, and not like explorers into the technological life world, but still passively changed. So you have two perceivable dialects. One is the Tel Aviv, and the other one is the Jerusalem. And for obvious reason, them being separated, and they develop different meanings to the words as well, not only new words or in most cases a different pronunciation. That different pronunciation means something. Every single aspect of use has a meaning. You can't take a part of the language and say, that is the part that has meaning. A little bit like Google Translator. No, it can never happen. That separation is not natural, and it's a misuse of language to try to make it. And now you can transfer this example to the two things, thermodynamics, hydrodynamics. See them as originating in the same language, sometime last century. What happened? They developed in different directions because there are different people, they are situated differently, their spaces are different, and even more important, their goals are more different than anything else. One is water, the other one is heat. I think it's rather obvious now why they wouldn't be coherent in any aspect. Of course, some of the words have very similar meanings, but others don't. But there is a difference, trust me, in every and each word after that long lifetime. Not even energy will mean exactly the same in those two very energy dependent areas of human endeavor. So this is what life world means, and this is also what more specific language's use means. And to really understand thermodynamics as close as you can, and that is what Paul Feyerabend tried to do, as close as he can, work with the people. He was still very far, of course he admitted that, but if you get as close as you humanly can, go further than Paul Feyerabend, you need to be an engineer in thermodynamics. Then you can understand the jargon. Then you can understand the language. And it does not matter if the people working with the different subjects know themselves it's different, consciously. That's way beyond the point. How many people do know they have a dialect? No. Their use will, however, be completely different. Think about this example. You want to play Monopoly, maybe on a day like this when it's too cold to be outside. You go inside, you put up the Monopoly board, and you can't find the hat. What to do? Well, there's a chessboard next to. Let's borrow a pawn and replace the hat with a pawn. What do we have here now? We have a pawn that will act as a hat in the game of Monopoly. But it will no longer act as a pawn, even if it's a representation of a pawn still. That will not change. And possibly people in the game will call it the pawn instead of the hat. And also change the word and call it the hat. But it will not move one square by time, or two when we speak about the first draw of the pawn. And it will not move by the will of the player. It will move by the cast of the dice. That's how the rules are in Monopoly. And I think I already mentioned that to construct a game, it needs to be tried out. And to construct laws, they need to be tried out. This is the same here. We need to try the world out, and that's what practices do, trying out the world. So the explicit rules don't cover everything. There are implicit rules, even in the game of Monopoly. I have played with people who know everything about the explicit rules, but they haven't hacked the implicit rules. Well, not the first time. That takes training. And it's the same with everything else. That's not a thing on this earth that doesn't take training. Manual training. You do something. So you can compare the pawn that acts like a hat in the Monopoly game. It's no longer a pawn. It's a hat to all effect. The same would happen if you take some constant or something from hydrodynamics and you put it in thermodynamics. But there is another idea lurking about here. Yes, indeed. I had a card tucked up my sleeve, and I want to tell you this card because it's going to make the whole thing even more interesting. One usually assumes, implicitly or explicitly even in some cases, that practices, scientific practices, somehow depicts a world, and sometimes people say the same world. And now we come to the case of completeness. We started with coherency, and now we're more into completeness. And things gets a little bit more complicated. Let's start like this. The words reality and world are also words in language games. And one could say that to say that practices depict the world already comes off as a bit off the tangent. Sounds a little bit weird. Do really practices depict or represent? Is that a correct use of the words practice and the words depict, represent, or refer? No one would say that carpentry, for instance, depict a part of the world. So you can study carpentry in some theoretical way, and you're going to have some idea of the world. You can use that word depict with a drawing or a painting or a photo, and you could say that it depicts the world or represents the world in an easygoing manner. That's how we usually do. We don't look at the photo and say, well, that didn't really represent the world. Usually not. And I'd say that is probably a more correct use of the word depict or represent. And maybe a bit more obvious. What would be the reason for thermodynamics or hydrodynamics or any other dynamics for that matter to depict the world? These are practices made by human beings for a purpose. It's a doing. We want to do things. We want to endeavor in something. It's an action. Thermodynamics, get a better heating, understanding how heating works, understanding how the sun works, you name it. All those could further humanity and do our doings better. They started out like practices. In some aspects, you could say they tell us something of the world, but in a very different way. At a distance, it's a bit forehanded, but one could say there is a sort of vague picture there, but it's not a depiction really, as is putting it too far. And if they were depictions, it wouldn't further humanity or inventory or exploration or technology for that matter. It would just depict like a painting. This is not criticism of painting. Painting does other things, but it's rather pejorative to thermodynamics and hydrodynamics to say that they depict. It's not a good thing, not to 100%. And this is bound, and this is a very good point from Paul Feyerabend. That's why I think it could be a good way to understand Wittgenstein via another person. You will get you will find a person more on your own level, and you can speak to each other. While speaking directly to Wittgenstein would make it too hard. He's too much of a giant. Feyerabend would say that if somebody said it's a depiction from thermodynamics or hydrodynamics, that would be the people who's working more with the theory part, not the majority, the most important, doing the practice. And I gather most, if not all, of the people working in thermodynamics or hydrodynamics are doing some practical things. The foundation is practical. Now it's easier to understand how the misunderstanding developed. Maybe a newspaper agent comes to the theoretician when he's working with hydrodynamics and he says, "What does this tell me?" And the newspaper guy has to write something. Well, it's going to tell you this about the world. So theoretician will have to and will express the theory like it was a depiction of the world. That goes with the usage. But his goal is not, let's call it implicitly, to show the world. He implicitly wants to do his job. And that is rather a fascinating job, being an explorer in those areas. But explicitly, it can actually sound that that is reality. Remember now, here it's a very good helping tool here. Remember gravity, how that could be explicitly put differently. The year 1500, the year 1700, the year 1912, and the year 1927, and so forth. That's the explicit. But the implicit differences are way too complicated to know before you actually do them, and that won't happen. So it's level on different levels, so to speak, and the level getting confused somewhere, that's the reason why misunderstanding furthers. And it's obvious with our amnesia tradition that the misunderstanding already lies somewhere underneath implicitly. In our bodies there is some sort of discoherence or not good coordination, but it's an obvious level mixing where there comes a journalist to the thermodynamic, and the journalist is not even within the field, or maybe he's within the field, but to a little degree, has to be to a lesser degree than the actual science, otherwise he will be doing science. This level makes misunderstanding come. If you change the level like that, there is a misunderstanding. So the article in the newspaper should be put in parentheses. And should be a writing further down. Remember, you are not you yourself a thermodynamic dynamist, or whatever they're called. You're not an engineer in thermodynamics. Remember that. On our lower level, it's bound to sound like depiction. But once you work it with it, it's no longer only depiction. It's something much more, actually. It's a doing, and that's much more than a depiction ever could do. Well, I said this many times before. Remember why Auge Bohr was so mad to his listeners at the lectures. Don't see the atom as an existence and the atomic model as reality, because that will put everything down to a grotesquely low level. This is much more grander than that. Reality cannot be so small as an existence. That's what he means. Making existence of reality is brutalizing, taking away so much. And many people think existence, oh, that's nice. Well, when it's suitable in the language game, I would say both Feyerabend and Wittgenstein says. Not otherwise. Otherwise, it's just a sheer mistake. Well, let me take a thesis here from Feyerabend. Languages and the behavioral patterns associated with them are not mere means to describe events, but they also constitute events. And this other thesis, the linguistic background system, grammar for instance, in every language is not merely a productive system for the formulation of thoughts, but forms the thoughts itself. So this is what could be meant by that word and meaning, in this case meaning use, whatever that is. It's a complicated matter. Meaning and word are rather parallel to mind and matter, or mind and body. And there the mind is the word and the body is matter, or the object. There is a parallelism there. And they're not exactly the same, because all uses are different, but it's a hint, and this is coming from Feyerabend, one of his theses. And thinking is a use as well. So the words we have are different because our uses are different. If I were to be an Hopi Indian, my use would be different compared to somebody who speaks Norwegian. Everything will be different. The thinking is different. Should be careful not to misuse the term thinking either. It also has its correct use. And I was not using thinking completely correct now, but it's better than nothing. Otherwise, I had to remain quiet. So this is how Wittgenstein works. He makes slight, lesser rule breakings than we usually do. There are much less. I think that's a very good description of what philosophical investigations are, is, and also the books, the Brown Book and the Blue Book. Well, you can say that there are sort of latent classifications. For instance, male, female, intuitive, but they can be more rational than the manifest one. And that's important. That's the implicit, explicit aspect of language, so to speak. And even a phoneme is the smallest part of the language, can take over distinct semantic functions. Except, for instance, the sound the is usually in English occurring in the definite article, and some other pronouns that are similar to the article. I haven't thought about that. It's very interesting. You have it also in them and their, this. You see here, it's sort of a pointer referral thing. And there will be a horrible physic resistance in the sound of made-up words, like, for instance, thob. And remember also, think. Maybe thinking is a sort of a pointer rather than a passive movement going on in the head. That sounds pretty much like Frederick Matthias Alexander. And the reason, as Alexander said, that our thinking seems to be something that passes around in our head passively, and we just watch the thoughts, it's because of the misuse. It's an expression of the misuse, or a readout of the misuse. That could be correct. That it's not something in such. A formal linguistic group can be related to a chain of events. A formal class turns into semantic ones in the course of time. It subordinates itself to a basic idea and draws other semantically fitting words. A formal group becomes a semantic group. And I think the most important thing to remember that it's a bit of a handful, but that we usually think that languages / thinking is a way of describing events, possibly also plans, but they could actually constitute the events. And that's also the message from quantum physics. Our language can, in some cases, in some language, construct a happening by cause and effect. Remember the tennis player Federer and how the Westerners watching the Wimbledon game, because Sir Roger Penrose were talking to Westerners in this recording. And he was speaking about the public at Wimbledon, and they made a description in existence, cause and effect. But that's not part of quantum mechanics. On a more fundamental basis, that is a good way of understanding. On a more fundamental basis, there is a more sounder, no, more foundational way of looking at it. And that would encompass even if there were a Hopi Indian or a Japanese person looking at the Wimbledon game. They would be a little bit like 15th century, 17th century, and 1912 in the example of implicit explicit. Whereas quantum mechanics is not just another way, but it's the way of technology. Almost impossible for us to understand with our language, because our language have shaped things into cause and effect in a specific manner. And that has even changed during time, as I mentioned in the lectures 4 or 5 times ago. Well, I think that's cold enough here. But language is use, and thinking could be rather different. Think of thinking as similar to thermodynamics, hydrodynamics, and not sheer representation that goes on in your head. Or for that matter, don't think of language as representative. It does something, it's a work, it's a use, it's an act, it's a verb. I think that's helpful as a start to getting into Wittgenstein. I have good reasons to come back to this. See if the sun shines tomorrow as well, and I will get back to this. And I say thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.